June 18th, 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. The smell hit them first. Charcoal smoke, searing beef fat, mesquite wood burning low and slow. 40 German prisoners stood in a ragged line outside the mess hall, hands trembling at their sides. They hadn't seen meat like this since before Stalingrad. A rancher in a sweat-stained Stetson flipped a ribeye the size of a dinner plate and called out, "Y'all worked hard, boys! Time to eat!" Nobody moved. One prisoner whispered in German, "It's a trick." Another replied, "Or a test." Then a man at the end of the line, thin as a fence post, eyes hollow, took one step forward, looked down at the steak on his tin plate, and collapsed face first into the dirt. Before we dive deeper into this astonishing moment, if you're watching from Texas, Berlin, Mumbai, or anywhere in between, drop a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from. It's incredible to think that history connects us across continents and generations. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us bring more untold stories like this one to light. Now let's get back to the moment that changed everything for these men. That night, under a sky thick with stars and heat, something extraordinary happened. Not a battle, not an escape, but something far more subversive. A barbecue that shattered every assumption these men had about their enemy. Because the Texas ranchers didn't just feed them, they treated them like human beings. And for soldiers who had been told Americans were ruthless capitalists who would let them starve, that simple act of decency hit harder than any bomb. By the summer of 1944, the United States was holding over 425,000 Axis prisoners of war across 46 states. Most were German soldiers captured in North Africa, Italy, and France. Men who had fought for the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and the Kriegsmarine. They arrived in America expecting labor camps, starvation rations, maybe execution. Instead, they found themselves scattered across ranches, farms, and forests, working under the Geneva Convention's guidelines. And nowhere was the contrast more jarring than in Texas, where open plains stretched farther than the eye could see, and barbed wire seemed almost decorative. Camp Hearn sat in the heart of cattle country, surrounded by mesquite trees and red dirt roads that led to nowhere. The facility housed approximately 4,800 German prisoners at its peak, making it one of the largest POW camps in Texas. The prisoners were housed in wooden barracks with clean cots, running water, and 3 meals a day, more than many German civilians were getting back home. The daily ration for American POW camps included 4,000 calories per prisoner, compared to the 2,000 calories or less that German civilians received under Allied bombing campaigns. They were put to work repairing fences, digging irrigation ditches, herding cattle. Hard labor, yes, but fair. The guards were local boys, farmhands and cowboys who had never left Texas until the war started. They didn't hate the Germans. They just saw them as men who'd made the mistake of fighting for the wrong side. Private Hans Weber, a baker from Munich, had been captured in Tunisia in May of 1943. He spent 6 months on a transport ship, then 3 weeks on a blacked-out train, convinced he was being taken to his death. When the truck finally stopped and the tailgate dropped, he looked out at endless sky grazing cattle and a cowboy chewing tobacco. The cowboy spat into the dust and said, "You fellas hungry?" Hans didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. It wasn't cruel. It was almost kind. The journey to Texas had been brutal. After capture, Hans and hundreds of other German soldiers were herded into camps in North Africa, processed through interrogation centers, then loaded onto Liberty ships bound for America. The crossing took 3 weeks through U-boat-infested waters, a bitter irony not lost on the Germans who had once hunted those same vessels. They were packed into cargo holds, given minimal rations, and told nothing about their destination. Many assumed they were being taken to Canada or Alaska to freeze to death in labor camps. When they finally arrived in Texas and saw the heat, the cattle, and the wide-open spaces, they thought they'd been transported to another planet. Over the weeks, something strange began to happen. The prisoners worked alongside their guards. They shared cigarettes. They sang songs. German folk ballads mixed with Hank Williams on a crackling radio. A guard named Corporal Ray Dusty Mitchell taught Hans how to saddle a horse. Hans fell off twice. Dusty laughed, not mockingly, but the way men do when life is hard and humor is the only mercy. "You'll get it, Hans," he said, slapping his back. "Every man learns the ground before he learns the saddle." The work was hard but honest. The prisoners repaired miles of barbed wire fencing that had been neglected due to the labor shortage caused by the war. They dug irrigation channels through rocky soil under a sun that turned the earth into an oven. They branded cattle, hauled feed, and cleaned stables until their hands blistered and their backs ached. But at the end of each day, they were fed. They were given cold water. They were treated with a basic dignity that many of them hadn't experienced even in their own army. By mid-June, the ranch foreman, a broad-shouldered Texan named Bill Connolly, decided to do something unheard of. He approached Dusty one evening and said, "These fellas have been working like mules. I want to throw them a barbecue." Dusty blinked. "Bill, they're enemy soldiers." Bill shrugged. "They're also men, and I reckon a man who works deserves a meal that reminds him what it's like to be human." The idea spread quietly among the guards and cowboys. Some thought Bill had lost his mind. Others volunteered to help. Bill Connolly was a third-generation rancher who had lost his own son at Normandy just 2 weeks earlier. The telegram had arrived on June 8th, 3 days after D-Day. His boy, Lieutenant William Connolly Jr., had been killed leading his platoon off Omaha Beach. Bill had read the telegram twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in his pocket. Then he went back to work. When Dusty asked him why he wanted to give a barbecue to German prisoners so soon after losing his son, Bill just looked out across the plains and said, "Because my boy died fighting hate, I won't honor his memory by becoming what killed him." They gathered firewood, borrowed extra beef from a neighboring ranch, and traded ration coupons for flour and spices. When the prisoners heard whispers of a big cookout, they didn't believe it. One asked Dusty directly, "For the officers?" Dusty shook his head. "For everybody." The rumor rippled through the camp like wildfire. Some thought it was a trick, others thought it was a dream. But when they saw the Texans hauling in crates of onions, sacks of potatoes, and half a dozen sides of beef, they realized it was real. The morning of June 18th dawned clear and hot. Smoke began rising from the fire pits at noon. Cowboys stoked the coals while the Germans helped chop wood and stir beans in cast-iron pots. For the first time in months, there were no guards barking orders, no prisoners standing at attention, just men cooking together. Hans stared at the steaks lined up on the grill, each one thick and marbled with fat. The meat alone represented more protein than he'd seen in a year. "In Germany," he said softly, "this much meat would feed a village." Dusty handed him a spatula. "Then you better make sure it doesn't burn, partner." The preparation took hours. The Texans showed the Germans how to season the meat with salt and pepper, how to judge the temperature of the coals by holding a hand above them, how to flip the steaks at just the right moment to lock in the juices. The prisoners worked carefully, almost reverently, as if handling something sacred. Because to men who had eaten nothing but thin soup and black bread for years, this was sacred. This was abundance they'd forgotten existed. As the sun dipped low, tables were set under the open sky, long planks of wood balanced on hay bales. Lanterns flickered on. The air smelled like heaven. Bill Connolly clapped his hands and called out, "You worked for it, boys. Sit down and eat." The prisoners hesitated. Was this some kind of test? Hans looked at Dusty, who nodded. Slowly the Germans sat side by side with their captors. Forks clattered, plates were passed. And then, just as the first man reached for his steak, something broke. Klaus Richter, a machinist from Hamburg, stared down at his plate. His hands began to shake. The fork slipped from his fingers and clattered against the tin. His breathing quickened. Then, without warning, his knees buckled. He collapsed forward, hitting the dirt hard. For a moment, no one moved. Then Dusty rushed over, kneeling beside him. A medic checked his pulse. "He's alive," the medic said. "Just exhaustion, maybe shock." But it wasn't shock. It was something deeper. Klaus lay on the ground, tears streaming down his face, and whispered in broken English, "Why? Why are you doing this?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Bill Connolly crouched beside him and said quietly, "Because you're a man. And men ought to eat." Klaus sobbed harder. Another prisoner began to cry. Then another. Hans Weber sat frozen, staring at the steak on his plate, and felt something inside him crack open. Years of propaganda, of hatred, of fear, all of it dissolving in the face of simple, inexplicable kindness. The emotional dam had broken. These were men who had survived Stalingrad, who had watched friends burn alive in tanks, who had been told that surrender meant torture and death. They had steeled themselves for punishment, for cruelty, for the inevitable revenge that victors always took on the vanquished. Instead, they were being served steak by men whose brothers and sons they might have killed. The cognitive dissonance was too much to bear. Several more prisoners broke down in tears. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to process what was happening. The barbecue continued, but the mood had shifted. The prisoners ate slowly, reverently, as if the food might vanish. Some laughed, some wept. Some sat in silence, overwhelmed. A cowboy brought out a guitar and strummed a few chords. Someone started singing, "Home on the Range." To everyone's surprise, one of the Germans hummed along, then another. Soon both sides were singing together, their voices blending under the Texas sky. As darkness fell, the fire burned lower. The stars came out, bright and endless in the clear Texas night. Hans found himself sitting next to Bill Connolly. The rancher was quiet, staring into the flames. Hans worked up the courage to speak. "Your food," he said carefully, "is very good." Bill nodded. "My wife's recipe. She died 3 years back." Hans paused. "I'm sorry," Bill shrugged. "War takes from everybody." There was a long silence. Then Hans asked the question that had been burning in his mind all evening. "Why do you show us this kindness?" Bill took a long breath. "My boy died in France 2 weeks ago," he said. "He was 23 years old. Led his men off a beach under machine gun fire. They gave him a medal, sent it to me in a box. He pulled out his tobacco pouch and rolled a cigarette with practiced hands. I could hate you fellas, maybe I should, but hate didn't bring my boy back, and it won't make this war end any faster." He lit the cigarette and took a drag. "So I figure the best way to honor him is to remember that you're somebody's son too. Somebody's husband, somebody's father. And that person back home wants you to come back alive, same as I wanted my boy." Hans felt tears stinging his eyes. He had never considered that the enemy might be mourning the same losses, carrying the same grief. In that moment, the war became something different. Not a clash of ideologies or nations, but a tragedy that had consumed them all, victor and vanquished alike. Later that night, after the fire had burned down to embers, Hans wrote in his diary, "We were told Americans were savages, that they would torture us, starve us, humiliate us. Tonight, they fed us like brothers. I do not understand this country, but I think I am beginning to understand what we were fighting against. Not cruelty, not weakness, but something far more dangerous to the Reich. The belief that every man deserves dignity, regardless of the uniform he wears." He closed the notebook and looked out at the stars. For the first time since his capture, he felt something other than fear. He felt hope. The next morning, the camp returned to routine. Fences were mended, cattle were herded. But something had changed. The prisoners worked harder, not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to. They cleaned the stables without being asked. They repaired a broken gate. They sang as they worked. The cowboys noticed. One of them joked, "Guess steaks work better than a whip." Bill just smiled. "Nah," he said. "Respect will do the trick every time." In the weeks that followed, the bond between guards and prisoners deepened. Hans taught Dusty how to bake bread using the limited supplies available in the camp kitchen. Klaus carved a small horse from mesquite wood and gave it to Bill as a token of gratitude. The men traded stories, shared cigarettes, and worked side by side until the line between captor and captive began to blur. When mail arrived from Germany, censored letters that took months to arrive, the guards gave the prisoners privacy to read them and grieve for the loved ones they hadn't seen in years. The war raged on in Europe. News of D-Day reached the camp, followed by reports of the Allied advance through France. The prisoners listened to the radio broadcasts with mixed emotions, relief that the war might soon be over, dread at what they might return to. Many of them no longer believed in the Nazi cause. Some had never believed in it. They were simply soldiers who had done what soldiers do: follow orders, fight for their comrades, and try to survive. And when the news came in May of 1945 that Germany had surrendered, it wasn't met with celebration or mockery. It was met with quiet sadness, because these men had learned something together: that the real enemy wasn't each other. It was the ideologies that had sent them to war in the first place. Dusty found Hans sitting alone that evening, staring at the sunset. "It's over," Dusty said. Hans nodded. "Yes. But what do we go back to?" Dusty had no answer, because they both knew that Germany was in ruins, that millions were dead, that the world had been changed forever. Hans returned to Munich in late 1945. He found his bakery destroyed, his city in ruins, his neighborhood unrecognizable beneath the rubble. But he rebuilt it, brick by brick, using skills he'd learned in Texas: how to work with his hands, how to endure, how to find hope in small things. On opening day, he placed an American silver dollar in the cash drawer, a gift Dusty had slipped him before they parted, and on the counter he displayed the carved wooden horse Klaus had made. When customers asked about it, he would smile and say, "It reminds me of a place where war forgot to be cruel." Years later, in 1963, an envelope arrived at a ranch in central Texas. Inside was a letter written in careful, deliberate English. "Dear Mr. Connolly and Mr. Mitchell, I have a grandson now. His name is William. I tell him stories about cowboys, horses, and kindness. I want him to know that mercy is not weakness, it is strength. Thank you for teaching me that truth. The world tried to make us enemies. You showed me we were always just men. Sincerely, Hans Weber, Munich, Germany." Bill held the letter in his hands for a long moment before reading it aloud by the fire that night. Each word seemed to float in the smoke-lit room, carried by the weight of memory and time. When he finished, Dusty, leaning back in his chair with his hat tilted over his eyes, exhaled slowly and said, "Guess the war finally ended after all." The fire crackled softly, throwing shadows across the familiar walls of the ranch. Outside, the wind swept across the same endless plains where, nearly 2 decades before, strangers had shared bread, water, and a moment of humanity in the middle of chaos. Somewhere across the ocean, a baker in Munich lifted his grandson onto his knee and spoke of a land far away, a land that had shown him how to live again, even after everything had been lost. That night in June of 1944, under a sky littered with stars and smoke, a group of Texas cowboys had done something extraordinary. They hadn't just offered food to their enemies. They had offered a lesson in grace, courage, and shared humanity. They reminded men who had been told to hate that they were still capable of kindness. And in doing so, they reclaimed a piece of the world that no war could destroy. Thank you for witnessing this powerful story of humanity transcending hatred. If this moved you, please subscribe for more forgotten narratives from D-Day.Two. See you in the next episode.